What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome to the live stream for Friday, February the 12th, 2021. This is episode 7 of season 3. And while I'd love to say, I've got an incredible show for you guys tonight, it's just the live stream. It is what it is. Tonight I will be talking about uh, Canon Rumors Kickstarter extra battery scam thing, a little bit about to-do lists and getting things done as a creative, or rather asking some questions, if getting some help in that maybe, which will lead me into talking about a project that I'm currently working on and sort of giving you a little behind the scenes, at least for me. I mean, I can't speak for anybody else who's a content creator, but at least for me, kind of the hurdles that I run into in putting out a video. And then finally, the main topic, if you will, for tonight's live stream, which is talking about cameras as a more generic programmable device as opposed to sort of the single purpose thing that they are. So to start this all off, to kickstart this, to start this conversation or this video, this live stream, that's what I want to say, to start this live stream off, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Canon Rumors Kickstarter extra battery scam thing. Uh, and I found that I got possibly unreasonably aggravated at this whole thing. So the deal is that back in November, it's interesting, I don't have the date here in my show notes. Back in the middle of November, CanonRumors.com posted I don't know what you want to call it, a blog post, a sales pitch, something to that effect, about this amazing new battery that was being kickstarted. It was coming to market, and it was the same size as like the LPE6 batteries, or slightly larger than the LPE6 batteries that are in Canon, that Canon uses in the R5 and the 5D Mark IV, but had twice the capacity, and you could plug it in, you could do all this kind of crazy stuff. And of course, a lot of people in the Canon Rumors community kind of immediately said, this doesn't look quite legitimate to us. Like, the company claims to be founded by a photographer, and when we go look at look for the photographer, the pictures that we find of this photographer online are not the picture that this company is posting of the photographer, and then maybe that maybe you shouldn't be kickstarting something. And of course, from a physics perspective, they were claiming twice the energy density essentially of a Canon LPE6 battery. So they were claiming like 4,000 milliamp hours in a package that, using pretty much the best technology that's out there right now, is not capable of holding 4,000 milliamp hours. You just can't the density isn't there right now. But the thing that really irked me about this whole thing, because look at Kickstarter, I like the idea. It's a great idea for like community fundraising, getting interest in stuff to, raise capital essentially for a project. And, there's very clearly the potential that whatever project you're backing may not come to fruition and may, fail. And that anything you kickstart, you kind of really need to invest, and that's not even a really good word. You need to back with sort of the understanding that unless this project is being, and even if this project is being put out by a reputable company that has a existing product line and infrastructure and so on and so forth, that whatever it is that they're kickstarting can fail and you can lose your money, and that you shouldn't the less reputable the company, or the less not reputable, the less of an existing base the company has, the more wary you probably should be of the project. I mean, granted, there's companies like Peak Design and Think Tank now even that are doing things through Kickstarter. And from the perspective of a company like that, putting something on Kickstarter to start a new product, there's kind of a, like, it makes sense to me because, for example, uh, I backed Peak Designs camera strap modules. I think they call them anchor links, and they already were using them in in their straps, but they didn't have a standalone product. And so I was very confident that they could manufacture the product, and that the Kickstarter campaign was more to judge the market viability of the product as a whole rather than the trying to actually fund the development of something. So if the product, if you're a company like Peak Design or Think Tank, and you put a new potential product on Kickstarter, to me, in my thinking at least, as a potential backer, you're not looking to raise money to do something you've never done before, at least in those, in that kind of, in the case that I'm kind of talking about. You're raising money, or essentially raising money to ensure that there is a viable market for the product. So you can make the product, and if you make your Kickstarter backing goal, then you know that there's at least that many people who are willing or interested in buying your product. And so in some cases, and if you're talking about getting something manufactured from a company, a manufacturer like in China or India or somewhere like that, there's a number of items that you have to buy a minimum quantity to have for that manufacturer to do that job. And so you really, even if you have all the resources to design and prototype and test and get everything good to go, you need to know that you're going to sell X number of units before it really becomes viable in some respects to go through the process of having it manufactured and warehousing it and so on and so forth. And if you're unsure that you're going to be able to sell, or there's enough interest in that specific product line, then having something like Kickstarter to, basically, like, they don't take the money from the backers until after the product's backed. So if you know that you can actually deliver as a company, then you can set a target where if you get the money, if you meet the backing amount for the project, then you have the ability to know that there is at least enough of a market that you can put this product out and it will be viable. However, the other problem with the other side of Kickstarter is it has just become, like so many things these days, a massive source of scams and a place for scammers to operate. And they can throw out, some CG renderings, which are not terribly expensive and very convincing, and especially considering the fact that, well, sometimes they are photorealistic, but even if they're not photorealistic, so often now, from even legitimate businesses that have products in development, we see CG renderings of what that product is going to be. So it's kind of not something that is inherently a red flag on its own, that, hey, look, they've only got CG renderings. So it's become very easy for sort of scammers to put stuff out and then take the money and run, and essentially, like, leave your the credit card companies footing the bill, trying to find them to get this, sue them to get I mean, or just not being able to refund, people's money. It's the thing with Kickstarter is it's really become something that you kind of have to be cautious about. But and that's not the fact that this was a scam or ultimately ended up being a scam on Kickstarter wasn't the thing that annoyed me. What really annoyed me is that Canon Rumors guy apparently, I'm going to say signed, but however you want to do, whatever you want to call it, he admitted to in his February 9th post that he had an affiliate arrangement with this extra battery Kickstarter program, and he got a portion of the revenue that he drove into that project. Now, he didn't disclose this in his article that he posted when he was talking about the Kickstarter battery. And at least here in the United States, I believe in Canada, and I'm pretty sure in the European Union, but I don't pay that much attention to, Canada and the European Union. And most developed nations, if you have an affiliate relationship, if you receive money from somebody for advertising or talking about or putting out their product, you have to disclose it. Now, this is ignoring the fact that that's just good ethics. If you're a YouTuber or vlogger or something, the ethical thing to do is to say, this product was given to me, or I have an affiliate relationship with this manufacturer or with this retailer for this thing. It's why any of the links that you see in the description of my YouTube video to say Amazon that are affiliate links are labeled affiliate link. If there is no label, it's not an affiliate link, and I don't get anything from that link. And the same thing goes for on my website. I do the same thing, because even ignoring, as I said, the fact that the law, the government requires us to disclose that as YouTubers and vloggers and bloggers and content creators, it is the ethical thing to do. It is the ethical thing to disclose that I have a financial relationship with the company that I'm saying you should buy this from, or you should buy their product, or something to, whatever that is. Now, I could make some arguments about just when and how that's exactly ethical, that really kicks in, but I'm perfectly happy with the position that if you get money for sending somebody through a link, you should disclose that. And so the Canon Rumors guy had this really and it does this, and it's awesome, and it's amazing, and you should do that, and this, and that, the next thing, and backstart it. And it really, the post did read like marketing copy from the company that was making the thing. Only it was posted by Canon Rumors guy, and there was no disclosure of the affiliation with them. So you would be potentially led to believe, and this is the ethical, and this is why the disclosure is required, you would be potentially led to believe that he truly, and he says he put his money into this project, bought or kickstarted the project himself, but you would be led to believe by reading the article that it wasn't just a mouthpiece for something that was, in this case, too good to be true. And, I read the article when he first posted it, and aside from the alarm bells going off in my head about, what is this really, like, this doesn't make sense to me. They're claiming basically better battery density than the best battery manufacturers in the world are claiming, and then they're also claiming that they're using the same batteries Tesla uses, but that doesn't make any sense, because Tesla batteries are made, is my understanding, are made for and by Tesla to Tesla specifications, and they are not available to anybody else because of the where and how they're manufactured. But regardless of that, so anyway, the long story short, I was really, really frustrated with this, with the fact that, no disclosures, no, there was the full sort of weight and of this is awesome and you should back this, and nothing to disclose the relationship, the affiliate relationship. I thought it was a complete lack of journalistic integrity. And then going back and looking at his apology that it was a scam, demonstrates this problem that is becoming so woefully common, not just in the United States, I think, but maybe even around the world, which is the, uh, I'm sorry, not sorry kind of apology. It's the, yeah, I got scammed too, and it sucks for all of us. And, there's, so Chris Voss, he wrote the book, he was a FBI hostage negotiator, and he wrote the book Never Split the Difference, has a saying that uh, yes is not, yes is worthless without how. And I'm increasingly finding that this applies to all kinds of things. Apologies to me are worthless without how. If you're in your apology aren't saying, this is how I got duped, and this is what I'm going to do to ensure that I don't deliberately attempt to be duped and dupe my readers into believing this. Uh, I really, yeah, okay, you're sorry, so what? And, that's kind of the frustration that I have here, and kind of the reason why from this point forward, other than getting some rumors, I'm never really going to pay that much attention to anything the Canon Rumors guy says, because there's been no, I got duped, and I deliberately, and I, in the process, duped people into believing that this thing was happening, and this is what I'm going to do to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Uh, I just, I don't know. I was incredibly irritated by that, and I really kind of, since it's camera related and Canon camera related, I felt that it was kind of something that I really needed to talk about here, at least to kind of get things off my chest on that. So moving on, I want to talk about getting things done, to-do lists. I don't have a really good terminology for this. I have always had a problem ever since I started writing about photography. I have always had a problem in that the content that I'm producing tends to grow exponentially. And I have for years and years and years been trying to find a way to sort of, I won't say address this. The exponential growth, well, so the exponential growth happens because as I'm writing an article or doing a video or putting a script together or a concept together for a video, I run into either this is long enough that I need to write multiple articles or do multiple videos just to keep everything sort of flowing. Or there's interesting things that come up in the process of looking at the content or doing the research that are worth doing another article or video on. And so that spirals off an idea for another project. Often that happens multiple times. There was a third idea I think I had, but that one's gone. So we'll just go with those two that I gave. And so what tends to happen to me is I'm working on a project, and in the process of working on the project, I come up with 2 or 3 more projects that are derivatives of or interesting spin-offs from, or I'd like to go look at that type of thing. Now, if you've watched my live streams, if you've looked at my content here or on my website at pointsinfocus.com, I don't do an awful lot of content that's like, let's go take some pictures of a model, and I'm going to show you how to put a flash into a softbox. I tend to go very deep into very technical content, which tends to be complicated, and complicated content tends to have nuance and other complications that stack on top of each other. That's where I think a lot of this sort of exponential growth in topics or subject matter comes up. And I had an epiphany the other day because I'm really trying to whittle this list down again with these projects. And I have my EOS R5 project where I'm to a certain extent just absolutely overwhelmed by the complexity and nuance and functionality that's available in the camera, and how to talk about that in a coherent way and present that and cover what I want and need to cover. And, I've been picking away at it, but I've picked away a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And now that the topics that are left for me to really dig into are the stuff that's really complicated and nuanced and detailed, and there's a lot of interrelated, this setting has this effect over here, and then that affects this over here, kind of thing going on. I've got an audio project that I'm trying to work on, that's like basic audio recording. What I found made audio recording make sense for me, because that was something I struggled with, and I don't think I'm the only person on YouTube who's trying to learn how to record audio better, who's trying to learn all of the what mics and recorders and settings and so on and so forth, and why this setting or why that setting works, and that kind of thing. I don't think I'm the only person who's struggling with that or struggles with that. And most of the stuff that I have to present in that is stuff that I've never really seen presented with, in all of the research and learning that I've tried to do in audio recording. And then I have other stuff that I've more complicated, not more complicated, but other stuff that's, testing of various things that go on. And so I've been doing a lot of research into like getting things done. I don't have a better term for it at the moment, but like how to organize and plan your time management, etc., around, accomplishing projects or accomplishing tasks. And I had an epiphany when I was looking at this the other night, which is almost everybody who puts out these kind of time management, getting things done articles either doesn't do anything complicated in their line of work or line of, what they're doing, or doesn't create things whole cloth. So, like, as a person who's like, nothing exists, I mean, things exist, obviously, but nothing that I'm doing a video on, the script, the research, the testing, the imagery, the graphics, the video, none of that exists until I sit down and figure it all out, starting with the idea and the concept and going all the way through to the actual final edited video that I'm presenting. And I realized that, like, so many to-do lists, sites, and suggestions say things like, set out the tasks that you need to accomplish and then basically just do them. And the problem I constantly run into is, what do you do? Like, that's the easy part. Like, if all you ever needed to do to figure out how to manage your time, manage your life, manage your schedule, and improve your productivity was write down a list of things you need to do and do them, you wouldn't need to write down the list of things you needed to do in the first place, because you just do them. The hard part is the doing them, not the writing down the things you need to do. And I have never seen anybody who really addresses how to deal with the things that you can't do. And I don't mean like can't do because, well, like your coworker didn't do their job and so you don't have the resources or something that's, blocking you externally. I'm talking about like writing a script means for a video, the kind of video I do expositional, like educational, like here's how something technical works so that you can be a better capable of making decisions for yourself on it. When I go to sit down and write that video or the script for that, I have something in my head. I have a thought, I have an idea, I have an understanding of what it is I'm trying to communicate. Sometimes, often, I can't get that out of my head in a coherent form that makes sense when I read the thing back, or even makes sense as I'm trying to write it. And, you could call it writer's block, for lack of a better word, and it's certainly a valid, kind of thing at all. And that's a you're not getting it done just because you wrote something down that you were going to do. And I've tried, I've tried to-do lists, and I've tried breaking tasks down into simpler tasks and trying to execute on that. And I've tried setting deadlines for things and using the deadline like, these live streams. I do them every Friday at 9:15. If I'm not there, I've screwed up essentially. And the fact that it's got a deadline is, holds my feet to the fire. That works for some things, but that doesn't just, like, at least in my experience, doesn't work across the board. And when you get into things where it's technical, and a lot of the projects that I do for videos or articles tend to be, they're kind of open-ended research based for me. So I go into it having an idea that something may be the case, something may be true, something may be false, something, I'm looking for something. But or I'm looking to understand something, but I'm not sure exactly how things are going to play out. And then as I test things, I run into questions. Why am I seeing this? Or why did I see something else somewhere else, etc.? And like I said, I have not seen anything that talks about how to deal with that. Like, if somebody's seen that and can point me in in the right direction for that, I would love to see some information on sort of how to deal with that problem. Because the problem I consistently find that I have creating content, and it's essentially creating content from whole cloth, is I'm motivated to do it. I know where I want to go. It's getting from I'm motivated to do it and knowing where I want to go to actually getting it out and completed and done. And when you run into hurdles, how do you know when to say, okay, I've done enough on this and there's just some questions? Like, I have a real hard time leaving questions on the table. So like I said, I don't have an answer to this. I'm looking for answers, and I'd love help if somebody out there kind of has a clue. Which kind of leads me into the little bit of the behind the curtain kind of thing. I am currently working on, one of the projects that I'm currently working on, I should say, is a while back I had posted a video about lenses for the R5, I think it was, and had a suggestion from somebody about upsampling instead of using a teleconverter. And I did some testing back in 2008, 2010, somewhere in that range, about, cropping versus using a teleconverter versus, upsampling. What gave you the best results, or what gave the best results? And, when I was doing that then, I was shooting with 10 megapixel cameras. Now I'm shooting with 45 megapixel cameras. Does what I learned in the past, in 2000, a decade ago, basically, or over a decade ago, does that still hold true? So what I learned over a decade ago was that a 1.4x teleconverter was better than just cropping and upsampling. And a 2x teleconverter was worse than cropping and upsampling, either from from the base image to, from an unconverted image, or from a 1.4x converter image to 2. And obviously technology's changed. There's new teleconverters that have been released. Canon's RF teleconverters are completely different from their EF teleconverters, and so on and so forth. And so I decided this was something that would be good to revisit. And I said how I find that some of these things just get overwhelming. So this is an example of, to me, how this stuff gets overwhelming. So the first question that I have to ask is, like, what's the end goal? So a lot of photographers, I think, would be very happy to take a picture with the teleconverter, take a picture without the teleconverter, and then upsample it, and then compare the two and determine which one was better. And the better image is the, that's just what you should do. That's the better solution. Is if the teleconverter is better, just always use a teleconverter. If the crop is better, then don't use a teleconverter, use the crop. And the problem I run into that is that I end up asking the question, which is, what's the end objective? What's the end goal? Where are you trying to go with this? Because there's a lot of photographers that, in my experience at least, they go out and take pictures and the only thing they ever do is show them on their computers. And if you're shooting with a 45 megapixel camera and all you're ever doing is showing the image on your computer, just cropping, not even upsampling, just cropping can get you a long way and a perfectly good image. Teleconverter versus upsampling. If they're close and your goal is a print, are they visually distinguishable in the print? Or is it that they're so close that you can only see a difference at 100% magnification on a screen and what's essentially unrealistic enlargement or an unrealistic enlargement factor from or of, what that image would be? And so how do you go about testing this? Adding to the confounding factors, if you're talking about a camera like the R5, f8 is diffraction limited. So if you're shooting with an f5.6 lens and a 1.4 teleconverter, or an f4 lens with a 2x teleconverter, and you're shooting at f8, you're going to be you're going to be at the diffraction limited aperture. You're going to have diffraction effects. How does that impact things? Does that impact things? Does it matter? And how do you determine whether it does matter or doesn't matter? Like, I'm in my mind, in doing these tests, my end product is a print. And so if I'm going to make a print, then how it looks on the print is the ultimate sort of what does or doesn't matter. That there's a difference that you can see in the computer is kind of immaterial. And so I wanted to throw up, I did these test images today, and I wanted to throw them up, and I wanted to sort of talk about this, because I haven't gotten the whole way through. So the two images that should be coming up on the screen, or should be on the screen now, were shot with an EF 70-200 f4L IS USM lens with the 1.4x Mark III extender where I use the extender. Both images were shot at f5.6, which is below the diffraction limited aperture for the EOS R5. These were both shot on an EOS R5. So obviously there's a mount adapter in there. And the two images here, which I have no idea if you can even see the differences on YouTube given the compression, but the two images here, the image on the left was upsampled and the image on the right was with the teleconverter. And there's a difference. You can very clearly see a difference. I should also add the test target here was essentially half the vertical field of view, so where it's 18 line pairs per picture height is really 36 line pairs per picture height resolution, not 18. Unfortunately, my test target is a target that I designed and printed. My printer isn't good enough to handle the higher than about 2,800 line pairs per picture height, and then it kind of just degrades into printing errors that then get captured really accurately if you're talking about, when you're taking the pictures. And so the point here is that, obviously I can look at these pictures and I can say, well, the teleconverter is better. It has more detail. It holds more detail properly at a higher resolution than the upsampled image. But that image isn't a print. It's a 1:1 1080p crop from the test image that I made that exaggerates and accentuates the differences in the two pictures. And the question is, does that matter in a print? Is that difference significant enough? At least the question in my mind is that difference significant enough in a print to make a difference in the picture, to warrant, say, using a teleconverter? Because, you know, what it comes down to is, like, on one hand, if not using a teleconverter makes a good enough print that you don't have to carry a teleconverter, that's one less thing you have to carry. That's one less lens in your bag. That's less weight. That's one less thing that you have to put on the lens and take off the lens and manage in general. And that's beneficial. That has benefits. And if the two images are visually indistinguishable and in a print, does it matter? Is the better picture, the marginally better picture, or the technically better, or the better in the absolute sense picture, better enough, or does it matter enough versus just having a perfectly acceptable print or printable image that's there? So, like I said, I'm talking through sort of a problem that I'm running into because I'm not entirely sure how the best way to go about testing and evaluating this whole question is, of, you know, what's better. Also, what's interesting is when I had done some tests a month or so, month and a half ago, sort of starting this whole discussion, I kind of found that the teleconverter on my R5 looked worse than an upsampled image that didn't have the that I didn't use the teleconverter on. And now this test, I'm finding that looking at a test chart, there's another confounding factor. Reality isn't a test chart. And it's perfectly possible for the detail in reality to completely obscure the change in detail, or look better even than having teleconverter and with, focus error, or, who knows what variation. So I think what I'm getting at here is, I just wanted to talk about some of the challenges that, I see in doing good, and I'm going to put this in quotes, science around photography. That this is science. This is definitely science based. I'm not trying, I'm trying to constrain variables. I'm trying to, eliminate biases and so on and so forth, because, like, to me, the thing is like, you can always say, I like the look of this lens, or I like the look of this picture. And that's it's subjective, it's opinion, it's preference. You can always make a decision to go against the technically correct or technically best thing. If the results are good enough that you don't feel you need to carry, like, everything's a trade-off, right? So if the results are good enough that you don't feel you need to carry a teleconverter and have to deal with the added weight and the added part and the added whatever, the benefit of that may outweigh the benefit of a technically better, or, higher quality image, especially given, again, and maybe this is another bias of mine that, comes through, but I have found that as we've gotten to 30 and 45 and so forth megapixel cameras, being technically better being pixel sharp, having that amazing image at the pixel level, at the like super end of the technical mastery, matters less and less and less when you're printing it or when you're viewing it or when you're like, the gains are smaller. The advantage of having this extra information, this extra detail, etc., it's smaller. It doesn't, a lot of times it doesn't even, like, it's not visible. It doesn't even matter. And you know, if the print's small enough, it's just, it's, yes, it's sort of it's better in the technical sense, but that isn't always, like, that doesn't necessarily mean that it translates to just being better, period, as an image. The image could be, you know, the final print, the final image could look just the same, even though, you know, if you examine the source in super detail, one's better than the other. So anyway, I wanted to talk about that because I'm definitely, that's a project I'm working on, and I'm interested to hear some feedback on what people, you know, what was it, where were people's interest in looking at that. Which brings me to the last topic of tonight's live stream, which is talking about cameras as a user programmable platform. And this came up because I had a very interesting conversation on YouTube earlier this week about having cameras be an app platform that developers could write things for, you know, in part in a response to the, well, basically it was in response to the video I put up, was it Wednesday? Yeah, Wednesday, talking about 10 things that I'd like to see Canon change in the EOS R5. And some of that stuff was stuff that could theoretically be added in an app or plugin or something to that effect platform. And I thought this was, you know, it's an interesting topic because it raises lots of questions. It has certainly has a lot of sort of pros and cons. And, you know, I'll be first to admit, I'm very on the fence about this idea. And I know some of that comes straight up to my own personal sort of bias and concern that with change. Change is always difficult. Change is especially difficult when you're a professional and you rely on something to do the job, to do your job, to make your livelihood, to have your income. And change can also be, even as an amateur, change can also be very difficult if you just simply look at the fact that cameras have worked one way largely for years and years and years and years. I mean, what the camera did has not really changed, even though we went from film to digital. And so the idea of changing a dedicated camera into something more like a smartphone with apps and plugins and can do this, and you downloaded this for that, and there's definitely a factor with me of, like, it's change and it's foreign and I don't like that. And, you know, it is what it is. Like, I'm at least I recognize, I feel that at least I recognize that that's a situation that does kind of exist. That said, let's explore the idea a little. So the first thing that I want to sort of throw out there is the question is, what's the point of a camera? So what's the point of a DSLR, a mirrorless, an interchangeable lens camera? And now, again, I'm talking here and I'm subject to my own biases and my own opinions on this matter, but it seems to me, and I'm certainly not going to even attempt to insist or assert that I am in any way an authority on this. But it seems to me that more and more of photographers, the photographic picture taking community, are, putting it pretty bluntly, losing sight of the fact that the end goal is a picture and not something else. There seems to be an awful lot of people that are photographers, that are claimed to be photographers, to me, that are interested in cameras as cool consumer electronics gadgets. They're not, and I don't mean this is a bad thing. I don't mean this as like, these people are not photographers and they're stupid or anything like that. It's a perspective thing, and it's a valid perspective. I'm not going to put it down, even though I disagree with it. But there's the perspective I keep seeing is the idea that the technology is important for the technology. I said in a previous video, I watched a photographer on Canon Rumors say basically, if Canon doesn't start using backside illuminated sensors, they'll never buy another Canon camera. And, my response to that is, what do you care what technology the sensor is as long as it makes a good picture? Um, the technology, the end isn't, the, the the way the sensor's made, the end is the picture you make with the camera. And given that the R5, which as far as we know, I've never seen anything to say that it says that it's backside illuminated, has the dynamic range and the read times and the performance broadly of Sony and Nikon equivalent sensor technology, which is backside illuminated, what do you care? What difference does it make? Um, I'm very fond, I've been saying this for years, but that pictures, not pixels, are the stock and trade of photographers. This goes back to when everybody was so concerned about how good a pixel was. And, like, I would kind of make the argument that good pixel, bad pixel, a pixel doesn't make a picture. And, you'd have people arguing, well, the D700, I mean, this was ages ago now, the D700 is a better camera because the pixels are better than the 5D Mark II. 12 megapixels versus 21, and yet the images overall that came out of the 5D Mark II were basically comparable in terms of, the overall image quality. Consumer electronics toy or gadget or cool tech, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I like cool tech. Cool tech is cool. But versus tool that makes pictures. And that's something I think anybody who's going to talk about this has to address in their position, their argument, where they're coming from, etc. Is where do they see, how do they see cameras? Because if you see a camera as a tool to make a picture, then a lot of the things that you're going to be interested in the camera doing are going to be focused on, or adding, or being able to tweak, are going to be focused on making pictures, adding capabilities that make pictures, and so on. So the gentleman that I was talking with, David Putzier, I think, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly, he said in one of his posts to me, quote, I could think of hundreds of apps to write for a camera. Cool custom icon packs, menu system animations, custom focus lock sounds, transition effects for the LCD slideshow playback, a company logo on a splash screen on boot up, and so on and so on. And yeah, okay, that's like all cool stuff. But what does that accomplish in making the camera make better pictures? So the argument, the thing that I've been talking about adding would be things like long exposure, synthetic neutral density through essentially averaging. And, I've talked about it briefly. I really need to do a longer video on it because there's what we have now, which is take a picture and average it to another picture and then average it and average it and average it. And then there's some super simple things that I really just, they're pretty darn simple, that would dramatically improve the capabilities of that function. And to me, and in my mind, the difference between these two positions is, you know, for everything that David said, icon packs, system animations, focus lock sounds, transition effects for the playback. Like, okay, transition effects for the playback, kind of, we'll set that one aside. Company logo on the splash boot screen. Okay, as a photographer who uses a camera as a tool, I don't want a boot screen. Boot screens exist and splash screens exist in software and on operating systems and in phones and so on and so forth, because the phone has to load so much information to get from the basic the start of the thing where the processor looks at a specific address in memory and starts executing code. All CPUs do this. To a functional environment where you can do something, it has to load so much information, all of this OS stuff. It has to initialize hardware. It has to configure things. It has to change things, that it takes time. And so the Apple logo on your iPhone with the little progress bar under it when you start your phone up or reboot your phone, or the boot screen when you boot your Mac or your Windows PC, or the splash screen when you start Photoshop, is there to give you, the user, an indication that the software is actually doing something. It's not just hung, it's not responding, it's progressing. Cameras obviously don't have splash screens on boot, because when you turn the power switch on, the camera is basically ready to shoot. And to me, this is one of those things that's an essential difference between a tool and a toy. And I don't mean toy in a bad way. Smartphones are certainly not toys in the sense that they're things you give to kids to preoccupy them or whatever, or that they're just for there to play with. But when I turn my camera on, I want my camera ready to shoot. And by and large, even the R5, which has a little bit more startup than the 5Ds or the 1DXs, you hit the power switch and you can start shooting within a half a second, if not faster. If I turn off the sensor cleaning, which you can skip or bypass, and I turn off the shutter closing, the R5 is from off to shoot at about the time it takes for you to lift it up from a car seat or a desk or a table or your bag or your side. The idea that you would want to have a camera like that could show a boot screen, because that would indicate that it takes a lot of time for the camera to start up. And this is from sort of the engineering side of things. This is one of those sort of balance issue things. The more complicated you make the software for the camera, the larger it is and the longer it takes the camera to boot. And you know, when we talk about things like, we're talking about sort of serious differences. The latest firmware for the Canon 1DX Mark III is about 80 meg. The latest OS install for Android or iOS is a couple gig. Fortunately, you can like over-the-air patch iOS, but it's between 1 and 2 gig is what that ends up being. And when your phone starts up, it takes a while. Like, you know, it does not boot instantly. You do not, like, it'll wake up instantly, but the phone's always on when it's asleep. it's completely different from the flip a power switch on a camera, where the camera goes from basically using no power and being off to using power and being on, versus, you know, a phone or not whatnot, a tablet, where when it's asleep it uses a little bit of power, but it's still doing things, and it's not at all, you know, quite the same. And, you know, of course, whether you use your phone an awful lot or not, I mean, I certainly run into this. That doesn't really matter how much I use my phone. I have to charge it every day and a half or two. Um, that's, you know, whereas if I turn my camera off, my camera is good for weeks. If I let my camera go to sleep, it's only good for a couple of days, especially if the GPS is running. Maybe a bit more, a week or two before like it starts running, sort of running down the batteries. Of course, a camera isn't checking email. It isn't getting updates from checking for updates from Apple. So actually, it probably would go longer than that, than a couple of weeks. But then that's the next question, right? Is if you're going down that road, if you say, well, okay, well, we won't turn the camera off, we'll put it to sleep and we'll have it boot and we'll have, you know, etc. What is that buying me? Like, you know, I don't really, you know, again, I have some biases here. I don't really want an always on, always connected camera. Like a lot of places I take pictures, I'm not connected. The idea that, oh, well, your camera would upload everything to the cloud for you is not really interesting to me. First, because internet access is still spotty in a lot of places. It's definitely spotty when you're talking about going out in the, you know, national parks, national forests, BLM land, that kind of thing. And then on the flip side, when you get home, what kind of internet access do you actually have there versus, you know, anywhere else? Like, I'm really lucky. I have gigabit now. That's why I'm being able to stream videos. But I didn't have gigabit until recently. And there's still plenty of places that don't have 100 megabit, let alone gigabit. It's just sort of the reality of internet access, at least here in the United States, if not pretty much anywhere. You go out in the middle of nowhere and you very little options. The best option you'll have is Starlink, and Starlink is not fully available yet, and therefore not running at full speed yet. So, anyway, like I said, boot screens, it's a thing. Custom icon packs. There's not a whole lot of iconography in these cameras to start with. And I'm dubious of how, like, icon-y, would you want to icon things up? Or system menu animations. Like, again, to me, camera is a tool. Things should respond as fast as possible. There shouldn't be an animation when I change from one menu page to the other, or I open something. It should just open and it should be there. Now, granted, I wouldn't necessarily have to use it, but then this brings me kind of to the big question, which is, what are the actual development costs? So one of the biggest advantages that I see the camera companies kind of have right now is everything is super tight. They don't need a Apple M12 or 10 or whatever the current processor is, or a Snapdragon, whatever the latest thing is. It's a super tight integrated thing, and you don't have, because everything's so tight, you don't need to have huge amounts of extra processing power. Now, there obviously is extra processing power because, as Magic Lantern people have shown, they were able to do things with the camera that, Canon never envisioned, and I didn't really think was possible. And, Hey David, how you doing? I just saw your comment, and actually, this goes actually to your point too on talking about having the game Asteroids run on a camera. Why would you do that? Well, obviously, one answer is, as you said, because you can. But another good answer for why you would try to do something, why you would try to implement a game or something like that on the camera is simply because it's a test of how much power is available, how much processing power is available. If the camera has enough CPU time to be able to run a simple game, or simple enough CPU power available to run a simple game, then that gives you a good benchmark for how much CPU power is available to do crazy image processing or interesting image processing or something like that. Um, but I wanted to go back to, like I said, so the question sort of in my mind is, like I said, adding stuff adds complexity. It adds size. It adds, uh, wow, okay, there goes a thought train got derailed there. It adds size and complexity, and it increases the separation between how tightly, or it decouples how tightly the firmware and the software running on the camera compares to the, uh, versus where it is versus where it would need to be. And so, one of the sort of inherent consequences of trying to make the cameras more open, more accessible, and like, there's a big part of me that kind of goes like, I would really love to have the cameras have some kind of programming environment that I could develop plugins for. Of course, one of the questions is, what APIs do you expose? But let me get back to that in a second. So the more you open it up, the more complicated and less tightly integrated and tightly optimized the code can and has to be for the camera, which adds uh, bill of material costs to each camera. They would need faster processors, or potentially would need faster processors, because you're trying to do more things now that you aren't optimized at a very low level, because most people who are going to be writing, and well, almost everybody who's going to be writing something that would run on the camera isn't necessarily going to be able to hand tune assembly for the critical sections of their code. So if you're going to make the environment available, the environment has to be available at a level that developers can actually exploit. So more expensive processors or higher performing processors. Of course, higher performing processors, even if you're building them on the latest fabrication processes from, say, TSMC, the they burn more power. Faster clocks, more complexity, bigger chips, uh, just more power consumption. And we're already seeing that power consumption is a problem, and especially when you start talking about mirrorlesses. Uh, Mirrorless cameras, you know, on a DSLR, it was on a 5D class DSLR, I was shockingly bad if I got 1,500 images to a pair of batteries. I would typically get 2,500 images of, shooting, like practically shooting, not messing around with the camera, on a pair of LPE6 batteries. And on a mirrorless camera, you're pushing 1,000 images under the same kinds of conditions, and you're changing batteries. 1,200, maybe 1,500 in some circumstances. Uh, it could be a little bit better. Talking about power consumption with respect to batteries is one of those things that's always very difficult, because the CIPA standard for how you test batteries in a camera is one thing, and it's not at all reflective of 20 frame per second motor drive blowing 30, 40, 50, 100 frame bursts, of some continuous interesting action. Uh, I had a 1DX Mark III, or a 1D Mark III, years and years ago, 10 frames a second, professional Canon battery stuff, and it never was supposed to be like, none of the stuff ever said that it would shoot 4,500 frames on a battery. And I shot an air show with it and shot 2,800, I think 3,000 frames on 60% or 55% of a battery. And so like I'd easily gotten to almost 5,000 frames on that battery, I think. And just because what I was shooting never hit the screen, high frame per second, it just was really efficient. So anyway, power is a problem on mirrorless cameras. It's a problem sort of, regardless of what's going on. Now, it would be great if Canon, Nikon, Sony, etc. would ship out the manufacturer of their processors to TSMC, and they were doing it on 5 nanometer process, and maybe hired some of Apple's engineers to, hired them away from Apple to like make super optimized, really efficient, tightly integrated, all kinds of crazy thing chips, and we could get, a more efficient processor in the camera. Although I'm not even sure that would help that much, because the sensor still eats a bunch of power. And I think the biggest factor in terms of power consumption is the EVF and the LCD display. But, as cool as that would be, the more stuff that's running, the more less efficient the code, the more power that's all getting eaten. And so that's the power side of things is a cost to us as a user. We need more batteries, but the processor side of things is a cost to us was a cost to Canon, which becomes a cost to us as a user because they need a more expensive processor. It either needs to be on a more expensive process or more complicated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The next thing that comes down the lines is how much more flash do you need in the camera? When the firmware on a 1DX is only 80 meg, I would not be surprised if there was only 128 meg of flash in the camera for the firmware, maybe 256 meg. You just don't need a lot. Everything's super tight. And the minute you start, well, first of all, making the firmware is more complicated, they get bigger, which means you need more room to store them. But then you have to deal with like, well, how do you handle plugins? Now, obviously, yeah, you could put them on a flash card. You could put the, and I'm going to call them plugins for the moment, but apps, whatever you wish to call it, you could put them on the flash card, which means, well, that I don't think is a really great plan if you think about it, because it means that your one CF Express card or your one SD Express card or whatever it is has your synthetic neutral density app on it, and the next one has your cool icon pack or whatever. And flipping from synthetic neutral density, flipping cards because you ran out of storage and all of a sudden your camera's capabilities changed or whatever. Like, you'd really want to install stuff onto the camera. So the more things you add, and I mean, this was a problem that Magic Lantern had. Everything that you wrote, any of the scripts that you wrote to run on the camera ran off your card. And so you had to have them on either all of your cards, or you always had to have, in a 2-card camera, one card with the Magic Lantern and the script, and then save everything to the other card, because you didn't want to, like, having capabilities change in sort of randomly in the field because you changed cameras or cards is not really good. And this would be sort of doubly the case. Like, one of the ideas that I started thinking about kind of with this discussion, when this discussion started Wednesday, was teaching the autofocus. So, we have the new autofocus systems from Canon, Nikon, Sony. They all do face detect, eye detect, and now they're getting into the whole animal eye detect. And one of the things that I've seen, if you go and you look at some of the reviews of like the R5 or whatnot, is some things the animal eye detect just doesn't know what to do with. It doesn't know what a giraffe's eye is. And the way my understanding for at least Canon is that the way I understand things, at least from Canon, is that the eye detect stuff is AI based. It's a machine learning thing. So they took tons of pictures of birds, dogs, cats, fed that into a machine learning algorithm to determine what the eyes was. That figured out the coefficients for the equations that are what's plugged into the camera. That's generally how that kind of thing, I think, tends to be done. I've not spent a lot of time on machine learning. It was one of the few classes I failed in college because I'm not a machine, and learning like one just didn't work for me. But anyway, so the idea though is if it is machine learning based, which I'm pretty sure generally is going to be, and you're a photographer, say in Africa on the Serengeti or whatever, then if Canon isn't teaching it about gazelles and you have a huge pile of pictures about gazelles, you might want to, you should be able to, in theory, plug that into a program that runs on your desktop, spits out the coefficients for the equations for what a gazelle's eye looks like or how to find a gazelle's eye, and then you could plug that into your camera and boost the capability of the autofocus system in a very specific way for you. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't help, but potentially you could do that. And, obviously, you wouldn't want to have, well, I've got the gazelle eye equation stuff on the card that I just took out of the camera, but now I'm shooting gazelles, So yeah, you'd want to have the ability to at least put something in the camera. Now, of course, flash for a camera or NAND flash, the kind of thing that firmwares goes on, I don't think it's not really that expensive. You could certainly put a couple of gig in the camera, I think pretty reasonably price wise. And I don't see why a couple of gig wouldn't be so critical or such a critical problem that but that it would be infeasible, I should say. But I think again too, it's a cost, and that cost would get pushed along to customers. Of course, David, you could have a second card slot, or you could even have you could sort of take a page from Android phones, put a micro SD slot in the camera, and have that be the card that the stuff gets stored on. But that has its own complexities, like adding a micro SD slot and having another card interface and all of that stuff, that I actually think it would probably be cheaper and easier to just, instead of having a 128 meg NAND flash in the camera, put a 2 gig NAND flash in the camera. And yeah, at some point you'd have to make decisions. You couldn't install this, or you had to, you couldn't install that, or you had to delete something before you installed something new. But on the same token, hopefully, if we're still keeping everything in the vein of a camera as a tool, as something that's tightly integrated, that we wouldn't be trying to put Tetris on it, or Bejeweled, or Tetris and Bejeweled and Minesweeper, and pick 15 other things and half a dozen games and the latest version of Doom and Windows, and like, most things should in theory be pretty small. Even something like, I mean, again, I'm not thrilled with the idea, but it's an idea and it's worth addressing, right? Is something like an icon set. There's not a ton of iconography in the cameras, and they're fairly low resolution as it is, and I don't see why you couldn't, say, replace all the iconography in an EOS R5 for the rear and top displays in a couple dozen K, as opposed to, like, it shouldn't be megs and megs and megs. And, really none of this stuff should be megs and megs and megs. So, a little bit more storage shouldn't be infeasible, but it definitely would be a small increase in cost. course, storage is only half the problem. There's also RAM. And RAM is, it's one of these things that can go all kinds of different ways. So the EOS R5 has a crap load of RAM in it. And I'm guessing probably 4 gig, maybe 8. I'm not entirely sure. And the reason the R5 has so much RAM in it is IPB compressed 8K footage. And so to do IPB compression, you have to keep you have to keep the I and P frames up to the next I frame, essentially. So the predictive and bi-predictive frames have to have other frames, either I frames or other predictive frames to predict from. And so basically you can do IPB compression for pretty much anything, but the cost is you need to have enough RAM to buffer all of the predictive data that is needed to make each predictive or bi-predictive frame. So the R5, and this is going to be true of the Sony Alpha 1, if Canon does 8K in the R1, it will be true of that, and it'll be true of the Nikon Z9 if that does 8K. All have a ton of RAM because of the need to have the buffer space to handle the compression for video. Because when push comes to shove, the still side of things, especially with a fast card like CF Express, the still side of things kind of doesn't become as big of a deal. There's no need to, you can push the data out as fast to the card as the card can take it, and you kind of only generate so much data. And, yeah, you depending on compression or whatever, yeah, you can run into some limitations, or you can have a buffer limit, but, the buffer for still images, especially CR3, the compressed raw images on the R5 are, basically unlimited. I mean, it's not technically unlimited, but from a practical sense of shooting, it's really hard to find a situation where you're going to just hammer down the shutter release and never let go of it until your card runs out of memory. So, that's kind of a thing. But the point here is that if you go back to a camera like the R6, it's not going to have nearly as much memory as the R5 has. And the R5 doesn't need to use all of the memory it has, kind of, unless you're shooting video. So that becomes the next sort of hurdle, is the more stuff you have the camera doing, the more memory the camera has to have available to do that stuff. Now, again, in thinking about this, I'm not sure that this is as huge of a limit as I maybe thought it would be in the first place. Because again, if we're keeping through with the idea of tight code, even for plugins, but we're still trying to keep everything tight and efficient and not just, implementing something crazy that doesn't really make sense on a camera, maybe another 128 meg or gig of memory. And honestly, having another 128 meg or a gig of memory in the camera is probably not that big of a cost. It certainly is a cost compared to what's there, but like we're not talking, like, I don't see any reason you'd need 6 gig of memory available to apps or something like that. I'm not even sure you need half a gig of memory available to apps, because you would have essentially anything that an app did that was using the sort of buffer memory processing. So, like, for example, the synthetic neutral density, you just use regular system memory for that, that would normally be buffer space. There's no reason to like pull the information into separate memory, do something, and then have more memory that was separate for that. Like, that just, you wouldn't need to do that. You would just use regular memory space. If you're doing video, like that would be one place, if you were going to do something sort of as a video effect, that would be one place where you might need to be able to have a fairly reasonable amount of memory, but maybe not, because you would do the whatever you were processing before compression, potentially or probably. And so you would really only need enough memory for, yeah, I don't know. That's where it gets tricky. And see, this is again where the engineering problem comes up, because if you're going to open stuff up, you have to be sure that you're going to cater to the right things. And so this was actually one of my other notes to think about on this is, so APIs, the whatever your programs are interfacing with, the program application programming interface that they're tying into the camera. How do you design that? Where do you go with that? What do you make available for that kind of thing? So, like, if the focus is not on low level camera stuff, low level functionality or capability, that's going to be a different set of APIs and versus what would be for low level functioning. So, for example, if we were talking about synthetic neutral density or updating animal IF with my own coefficients for the kinds of animals that I shoot, that would require a specific set of APIs, potentially in the case of like doing synthetic neutral density properly, low-level access to get sensor data read out or read out the sensor data, versus, say, changing the menus or changing the icons or putting a boot screen logo or something like that. That would need a set of APIs that worked on the high-level stuff, on the user interface side of things. And to a certain extent, you'd absolutely have to have both, because if I was writing a plugin for synthetic neutral density, I would have to be able to write a user interface to go with that, because it's not something that's just, well, you hit the synthetic neutral density plugin, you install it and it works, or something like that. Like, you have to be able to set, like exposure time, or how much neutral density was going to be, what the neutral density factor was, or something like that. And so that would require at least some level of both low level and high level user interface type access. So where am I going with this? I don't know. I'm kind of rambling at this point because it's getting late and I've been going all day. I guess when push comes to shove, like so many things, I'm not trying to I'm not trying to come down one way or another on this. I'm trying to sort of explore the probability space, for lack of a better word. I'm trying to think about what would be involved and what would be necessary for various things. And yeah, David, that's kind of the problem. Who's going to give up low-level access to the camera hardware? Like, you're right. I don't think Canon would give it up. I don't think Sony would give it up. I don't think Nikon would give it up. I think they would all be far too concerned about, somebody squeaking out some secret sauce that they're doing in their, their color science or something, and then taking it to a competitor. Because again, one of the problems is that if I can write software for the camera, if I'm Sony or Nikon, I can buy the camera and I can start playing with the stuff at a very low level. And I mean, not that Nikon or Sony couldn't do that now, but it would certainly be a heck of a lot easier to, say, reverse engineer or clean room reverse engineer or whatever, if I can run my own code and I can poke around at the, inside the inner workings of the camera, versus if I actually had to like decompile and try and figure out what the firmware was doing, and maybe it's only an update firmware, so it's signed or encrypted, or I'm not even sure what's going on with the firmwares. I mean, there's a whole lot of sort of hoops that could be there. So yeah, that would be a problem too. And like I said, I think to a certain extent, the really interesting stuff that you might want to try and do with a camera, or does require a certain level of low level access. Like Magic Lantern had a technology that they had come up with called dual ISO. And basically what they found out was that the Canon cameras, you could read subsequent row, or you could change the gain, the ISO essentially, but the gain of the sensor amplification on a like per row basis. It might have even been per pixel. And somebody figured out that you could yeah somebody figured out that you could basically read alternating pairs of rows at different ISOs and get super massive dynamic range. You had to do some processing to get it to work in post. Well, dual pixel, in the modern modern Canon stuff, if I could read out the left sub pixel at ISO 100 and the right sub pixel at ISO 1600, I could get some wicked dynamic range out of the camera with just, without really, like, at a pixel level. Yeah, okay, there's maybe some issues in the way you'd have to process things, and obviously you'd have to custom process everything, but like, that's also the kind of thing that makes it really interesting. And this was back when Canon was the underdog, the bottom of the barrel with dynamic range, and doing something like that and suddenly having better than best of class dynamic range, that, like, that's a really compelling feature, at least to me as a photographer. I mean, granted, with the way Canon does dual pixel RAW, you can get one more stop of highlight detail out of your images, which I think is pretty cool. You need, what is it? Dual, it's made by the company that does, I think it's Fast Raw Viewer or something like that. And you can basically, the way they did, and I think this is smart, the way they store the information for dual pixel RAW is you have one set of image information that's the left plus the right pixel, and then another set of image information that's just the right or left pixel. So the dual pixel RAW people call it A and B, or A plus B and A, or A plus B and B, or whatever it is. And because everything is processed in the camera with a 14-bit ADC, and if you add two 14-bit numbers together, you can get a 15-bit number, which really, in some ways, means that Canon should be like moving to 15-bit RAW files, because the A plus B could give you a 15-bit information. But anyway, the A plus B will clip, but the other part, the half subpixel, won't necessarily clip, because it could go up to 14 bits as well. And so you'd have, the A plus B could be 15-bit, which would be clipped to 14-bit, but the A and B, or the B only, can only go up to 14 bits. And so that gives you basically your highlights that were lost because they added and clipped in the sum, the big pixel file. Now, of course, why the way Canon did it makes sense is a dual pixel RAW file is trivial to implement or deal with in a program like Lightroom or Camera Raw or third-party RAW program, because the combined pixel part is just a CR2 RAW file. It's not something that's different. Like if they'd have gone, A pixels are saved and B pixels are saved, and then in processing they combined them to get the whole thing, that would be, you'd have to have completely sort of different handling of those raw files as a, both in their software but as a third party. And I'm obviously Canon's not stupid enough to realize or to understand that, hey, look, lots of people who shoot Canon don't use DP, Digital Photo Professional, or whatever their software is called. Like, yeah, I don't even know what the software is called off the top of my head. I don't use it that hardly or that much. So having something that was usable outside of that fairly trivially, like without having to completely rewrite the world, makes sense. But it also means that, like I said, you can recover a stop of highlights. So the 14 stops or whatever it is at ISO 100 becomes 15 stops. And, that's a powerful tool. I've used it in landscape photography where I was in a, really high dynamic range situation, didn't want to shoot HDRs, didn't know if I would get the highlights completely in line. So I flip on dual pixel raw and I get a one shot, essentially stop extra headroom for my highlights, which is, like I said, super useful if you're, in that kind of situation. But anyway, yeah. So, like I said, I'm talking about this largely because I think it's interesting. It's cool. I mean, like I said, goes back to, is your camera cool electronics or is it a camera? And I'm one of these. I'm really of the opinion that, like, it can be both. Like, we could study the camera and we can play with the camera. We can do cool things with the camera. That pushing it beyond the design parameters, pushing it to do something new. And like I said, the reason, the biggest compelling reason for me that I see having something like this, and why I think it was a big mistake that Canon didn't basically either, for lack of a better word, absorb Magic Lantern or back Magic Lantern super hardcore. I mean, they basically said that they wouldn't sue them and that they would repair cameras that had Magic Lantern installed, but they would flash them back to the Canon firmwares, and that they wouldn't void warranties. And the exception to this was if the Magic Lantern people started playing with the 1DX or cinema cameras. And like, this is the frustrating thing for me from the business perspective, because I get where Canon's coming from. They're trying to protect their intellectual property. They're trying to protect their markets, etc. The thing that makes programming your camera a user programmable environment, whatever you want to call it, a user development environment, so powerful, is there's so many niche things that I, as a photographer, could want to do or would want to add that maybe will almost certainly don't meet the threshold of this should be added from, worth the time to put a team of developers on adding this to the firmware as a whole. And plus, you have the second problem, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning of this little bit. I have an inherent bias against change and against change in cameras. And when you start talking to professional photographers, and this is like perfectly reasonable, right? If you make your money, if you make your living and you're dependent on your camera working, you're going to be incredibly emotionally invested in your camera working and not changing and not going off down some crazy road, and not like there was a Nikon prototype with a camera where the grip was like you held it like a camcorder instead of like a camera that we're used to. And it totally flopped when the professionals were playing with it, even though the ergonomics of not having to pronate, whatever the heck this is, twist your wrist, even though the ergonomics of that are like markedly better, but nobody wanted it because it was a change. And like, I don't blame them, because change is difficult. Change, it's very hard. It's very hard, especially if you don't have a background in like something other than photography. So I went to school for computer engineering, and I screw around with software and electronics, even though I do photography now. And if you don't have a background in something like that, any kind of engineering, doesn't matter what kind of engineering, but a background in, or science or physics or math or something like that, if you don't have that kind of background, if your background is, I got an art degree, like, or something to that effect, and there's nothing wrong with like going down that road and becoming a photographer. Some of the best photographers basically have art degrees and became photographers, and they're wonderful photographers, and it's no slight against them. But on the same token, they're not the ones that are going to generate new ideas about how to do things or new approaches to things. I always tell the story. Nikon cameras, the ISO button was in absolutely like the worst place to reach to hit the ISO button to change the ISO. And this was a derivative that held over from, you didn't need an ISO button on a film camera, so we'll just put the ISO button wherever and not worry about it. And basically, I would talk to Nikon people in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and I would get everything from like, I'm a professional photographer, I don't need to change the ISO, I know how to set it properly, to, well, I can do this weird thing where I can reach back and claw hand the ISO button and it does this, and it works. And it was like, none of them ever could see value in having an ISO button like where Canon puts it right behind the shutter release, or especially now with the R5 and R6 where it's a dial and you don't even have to hit a button. And then all of a sudden there was that exodus of Canon photographers to Nikon where the Canon pros were going to Nikon because Nikon was beating Canon around the 1D Mark IV era. And they're going, we want an ISO button. And then all of a sudden you could program the movie record button on the D4 and the D800, D810, that era camera, to be ISO. And it was right behind the shutter release. And the Nikon pros are all like, wow, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. They couldn't see it until it was basically dropped in their lap. And then it was the greatest thing that they, it was a great advancement. And that's a true kind of statement thing for so many things. If you're a professional, and the reality is, it ain't their job. It's not the job of a professional photographer to think up a cool way for a camera to do something new. And so, for lots of professional photographers, like using neutral density filters, they work. Why change it? Where the controls or how the controls are laid out or how things are done, it's good. It works. I know how to use it. Why change it? There's a long list of things. So you're going to get push if you're Canon from putting in a new feature. You're going to get pushback from professionals testing the camera that we don't need this feature because we already can do this, or we already have neutral density filters, or why would we want to do this thing that, like, it's I don't understand it, I don't want it, I don't need it. And that's where this kind of thing, and that's why I really like the idea, I just can't ever quite figure out what the way to implement it is. But if I can write a synthetic neutral density tool for the camera, mode for the camera, and I can put it out there, and people who use neutral density filters can see the benefit of having it because they can use it, they're going to be much more apt to say, this is really useful, than trying to explain the idea to them. The same thing goes with training your autofocus system. If you're if you do shoot people, you don't care because that's what the thing's trained for already. But if you shoot some niche animal, being able to train the autofocus system based on your 20,000 image library of, I don't know, two-eyed left foot fish or something like that, they that would be really useful in the idea of being able to do that. But it's like, that's not something that Canon, when they talk to portrait photographers, is portrait photographers are going to say, oh, autofocus works great. It's not a big deal. I mean, actually, speaking of autofocus, and I'm going to be real brief on this, the 5D Mark II is a perfect example of this. Canon professionals told Canon the autofocus in the system in the 5D was fine. And Nikon came out at the same time with the D800 with a 35-point system, and the 5D Mark II had the same, like, 8-10-year-old at that point 9-11-point system that was objectively crap compared to what Nikon put in the D700 and the D3. And you know, Canon didn't not change the autofocus system because they didn't have an autofocus system to change it to. They could easily put the 1D autofocus system in there, and like, it would have been great. They did it because the people that they were getting feedback from said the autofocus system's fine. We don't need more. You know, I guess there's a cautionary tale in there anyway. Anyway, I am way over time. I don't want to make it to 2 hours on this live stream, so I'm going to wrap this up here. If you made it this far, and this definitely includes you, David, because you're still posting comments, but if you made it this far, thanks for watching. If you're not subscribed and you're watching this video, you know, whenever, and you thought this was interesting or whatever, please smash that like button. Please consider subscribing. I do a live stream every Friday. Other than that, my content is kind of all over the place, and it gets posted when I get it done, and I try really hard to get it done, but as I talked about in this live stream, it doesn't always get done, or it doesn't always get done quickly. So you may want to hit that notification bell so that you get notified when I post something, because like I said, it's kind of irregular. Other than that, as I said, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.